It's kind of wild when you think about it. We live on a blue planet, right? Over 70% of it is covered in water. And yet, we're somehow facing a global freshwater crisis. It's a huge paradox. So, what if the answer isn't about desperately searching for more fresh water? What if instead we could use the two things deserts have an absolute ton of, sunlight and seawater, to actually make them bloom? Let's dive in.
Okay, so first, let's just get our heads around how big this problem really is. A massive 70%. Think about that. 70% of all the fresh water we use on this planet goes straight into agriculture. Now, in the driest places, that water comes from these ancient underground pockets called aquifers. But here's the catch. They can take thousands of years to fill back up. We're basically mining for water that we can't replace, and yeah, those wells are starting to run dry.
So what this really boils down to is that we've kind of trapped ourselves in this really dangerous cycle between our food, our water, and our energy. And as more and more people live in these super dry places, I'm talking the Middle East, North Africa, we are getting desperate for a way to grow food that doesn't completely drain what little fresh water we have left. We've got to break that link. And that right there is where this incredible idea from the early 90s comes into play.
Okay, so enter the inventor, a guy named Charlie Payton. And he had one of those simple but brilliant observations. He looked at the hottest, sunniest places on Earth and realized, hey, wait a minute, a lot of them are right next to the biggest body of water we have, the ocean. His huge breakthrough, his aha moment, was to stop thinking of a greenhouse as just, well, a house for plants. He started seeing it as a thermodynamic machine, an engine that could use the desert's own heat and the ocean's water to literally create its own rain.
So the big question is, how on earth do you get a greenhouse to make its own rain? Well, it turns out the secret is to just copy one of the most basic processes on our planet, the water cycle. Yeah, that's right. Now, engineers have a pretty fancy name for it, humidification-dehumidification, but honestly, the idea behind it is so simple.
The real magic here is something called low-temperature distillation. And I know that sounds complicated, but just forget about those giant energy-guzzling desalination plants for a second. This whole process is powered almost entirely by the sun's own natural heat. You're basically just taking seawater, letting the sun do its thing and turn it into vapor, and then you just cool that vapor back down to collect perfectly pure, fresh water. Simple. All right, let's walk through exactly how this works, step by step. So picture this. Hot, dry desert air blows into the greenhouse, but it has to pass through this special wall that has seawater constantly trickling down it. Now, the heat from that desert air makes some of that seawater evaporate, and this does two amazing things at once. The air gets super humid, and it also gets way cooler. This cool, misty air then drifts over the plants, creating this perfect, almost tropical climate for them to just thrive in. And then for the final step, that incredibly humid air is drawn over a set of pipes with cold seawater running through them. The air hits the cold pipes, it can't hold all that moisture anymore, and bingo! Fresh, pure water condenses right out of the air and gets collected for irrigation.
And this comparison just shows you how much of a game changer this really is. Think about it. A normal greenhouse stuck in the desert is constantly fighting the heat, right? It needs vents, it needs power for fans, and it's always guzzling precious fresh water. But the seawater greenhouse, it uses the desert heat. It runs on seawater. And this is the absolute kicker, it doesn't just consume water, it actually produces a surplus of fresh water. It's a net producer, not a consumer. It's completely flipped the script.
Okay, I know what you're thinking. This all sounds fantastic in theory, but does this thing actually work in the real world? Out there in some of the most brutal environments on the planet? Well, the answer is a resounding yes. So let's take a look at how this idea went from a tiny prototype to these massive world-changing systems.
So the whole journey kicked off way back in 1992 in Tenerife. That was the first pilot project, and it proved the basic concept worked. In fact, it actually produced more fresh water than the plants inside needed. Then in the 2000s, it got put through the ultimate trial by fire in Abu Dhabi, growing crops successfully in insane temperatures, like over 50 degrees Celsius, that's 122 Fahrenheit. And that all leads to today with these incredible projects like the Sahara Forest Project. I mean, these are the magnum opus. They're combining the greenhouses with solar power and actively regreening the desert around them. It's the full vision realized.
But here's where it gets really interesting. It's become super clear that this whole system is about way more than just growing food and making water. It creates this whole cascade of other amazing benefits, and it all starts with the plants themselves.
So try to think about this from a plant's point of view for a second. Out in the dry desert air, a plant has to keep these tiny little pores on its leaves, they're called stomata, closed up tight so it doesn't lose all its water. The problem? That's how it breathes and eats. So when the pores are closed, the plant basically stops growing. But inside the cool, humid air of the greenhouse, those little stomata can stay wide open all day long, just sucking in CO2 and supercharging photosynthesis. The plants are basically living their best life. They're happier, they lose way less water, and as a bonus, a lot of desert pests just can't survive in that cool, damp air.
Okay, but this is all starting to sound a little too perfect, right? There's always a catch, especially with desalination. When you pull the fresh water out of seawater, what are you left with? This super salty, concentrated brine that can be really toxic to the environment. So what do you do with all that leftover salt? Well, this is where the system gets really clever.
So instead of just dumping that nasty brine back into the ocean, they divert it to these shallow outdoor ponds, and then they just let the sun do the rest of the work. The last bit of water evaporates, and what's left behind? Valuable commercial-grade sea salt. Not to mention other useful minerals like magnesium and calcium. It is a completely zero-waste system. It takes what would be a toxic byproduct and turns it into another valuable product. Nothing is wasted.
So when you put all of these pieces together, you start to see that it's so much more than just a clever bit of engineering. It's really a whole philosophical shift. It completely reframes how we think about the desert, not as some barren wasteland that we have to fight against, but as a place that is just full of immense, untapped potential.
And this is where the idea gets truly visionary, really ambitious. What if you didn't just build one of these, or a handful? What if you built a massive green wall, a whole chain of these seawater greenhouses stretching for miles and miles along arid coastlines? They wouldn't just be farms. Altogether, they'd act like a giant humidification engine, constantly pumping moisture into that dry inland air. Could that actually kickstart local rainfall? Could it, and this is the big one, could it actually begin to reverse desertification itself?
And really, that's the ultimate question that this technology leaves us with. Is this just a really smart, sustainable way to farm in the desert? Or is it something much bigger? If we scaled this up, could it become a powerful tool to actually heal landscapes, to create new microclimates, and to fundamentally change our planet for the better? It's an idea that really forces us to work with nature instead of against it, and you have to wonder, it might just be one of the most important ideas we have for the future of our planet.